Della Ryland. 23 years old, and by the time the sun came up over the North Penn that morning, every head of cattle my father ever counted was gone. 120 head. Gone in the night. The gate roped open like somebody wanted me to see it swing. I stood there at first light, and I did not cry. I want you to know that. I counted the tracks in the mud instead, because that was the habit my father put in my hands, and habit is the last thing grief takes from you. There was one thing left on the top rail. A folded bill of sale. My uncle's handwriting on it. The sale had happened the day before at the Slate Creek stockyard. In front of 9 drovers and the auction clerk, my uncle Emmett took the money at the rail, and he turned to me, loud enough for all of them to hear, and he said, "They're just cows. Della, you cry over cows and wonder why no man'll have you." So the next morning, instead of going to the sheriff like he expected, I walked into the Territorial Stock and Loan, and I asked August Krell a question no one figured a woman would think to ask. If you've ever been treated as invisible by your own family, this story is for you. Before I tell you the rest, do me one kindness. Subscribe so you can ride out the whole of it with me, and comment the town you're watching from. I want to see how far Della's story rides. Go on. I'll wait. Now, let me take you back, because a thing like this doesn't start at an empty gate. It starts years before, at a kitchen table, with a man and a leather book. My father was Amos Ryland. He came into the Wyoming Territory with a wagon, a wife, and $40, and he died with a ranch called Ryland's Draw and 90 head of good cattle. In between those two things, he taught me the only religion he ever practiced. He kept a tally book, leather cover, gone soft at the corners from his thumb. Every calf that dropped went into that book. Every steer he sold came out of it. He wrote small and even, and he never once trusted his memory over the page. He'd sit me on his knee at that table when I was 6, then across from him at the bench when I was 10, then beside him as a grown girl, and he'd run his finger down the column and make me read the numbers back. "A cow you can't account for," he told me, "is a cow you've already lost. Cattle is just debt you can feed, Della. It eats, it grows, and one day it pays you back, but only if you wrote it down." I thought it was arithmetic. I know now it was armor. My mother died when I was young, of a fever that took half the valley that winter. That left my father and me, and it left one other person hanging at the edge of our lives like a burr you can't pick off a wool coat. My mother's brother, Emmett Vane. Emmett was a town man in a country of ranchmen. He wore a good coat and let it get shabby slow. He sat at the faro tables at the Antler House and told anybody who'd listen that he was a cattleman's brother-in-law, as if that were a trade. My father tolerated him the way you tolerate weather. He'd feed him at our table and send him back to Slate Creek with a ham, and after the wagon rolled off he'd say to me, "Quiet. Your uncle counts a man's cattle to see what he can borrow against them. Never let him near this book." I was 19 the winter the lung fever came for my father. It took him slow, over 6 weeks, and I nursed him the whole of it. Near the end, when he couldn't hold the pen anymore, he had me do the tally in his stead, and he watched me write, and he nodded, and that was the last approval he ever gave me. He died on a gray morning with the wind coming off the draw. Wade Corliss, his foreman, dug the grave himself and wouldn't let a hand help him. Then the law came, and the law did to me what the law did to women out there in those years. It did not ask what I could do. It asked what I was. A single woman of 19 could not hold an estate in her own name in that territory. The court needed a man to stand as guardian of the Ryland property until I married or came of a settled age, and the nearest male relation, the one the court appointed without ever riding out to see the place, was my mother's brother. Emmett Vane became the master of everything my father built, and I became a girl who lived on it. Now, here is the part I need you to hold on to, because if you only see the ending, you will miss what it cost. For 3 years, Emmett left the running of Ryland's draw to me. Not out of kindness, out of laziness. The town suited him. The tables suited him. As long as the ranch sent money into Slate Creek, he was content to sign his name where Krell told him to and let the girl do the sweating. So I ran it. Me and Wade and 2 hands through the season. I calved out the herd in the spring snow with my sleeves froze to my arms. I doctored screwworm and pulled bogged cows out of the draw and sat up nights with a lantern when the wolves came down. And I kept the book. My father's book. In my father's hand, then in mine. The columns marching on past the day he died like he never left the table. The herd was 90 head when they lowered my father into the ground. 3 years on, it was 120. I grew it. A woman the law said couldn't be trusted to sign her own name grew that herd by 1/3, while the man who owned it on paper drank his standing away in a card room 40 miles off. I tell you that not to boast. I tell you so you understand the size of what was taken. Those weren't just cows. They were 3 years of my hands. They were the last thing my father and I made together, still growing, still adding up in the only language he taught me. And Emmett was about to spend them like a bad night's markers. It began small. It always begins small. That's how they get their hand in, not with a theft you'd fight, but with a favor you can't refuse without looking ungrateful. That autumn, Emmett rode out to the draw more than he had in years. He'd taken losses in town, though I didn't know the depth of them yet. He sat at my father's table, his table now, by the court's word, and he told me he'd been thinking, that the accounts had gotten too tangled for a young woman to fret over, that he was going to simplify things. Move the ranch accounts at the Territorial Stock and Loan into his own name proper, so the bank wouldn't trouble me with paper I shouldn't have to read. To spare you the arithmetic, Della, he said, and he smiled when he said it, and he helped himself to more of my stew. I said nothing. What was there to say? He held the pen the law gave him. But I went out to the barn that night, and I stood in the dark a long while, and I understood that a man does not simplify a thing he means to keep. He simplifies a thing he means to sell. Wade felt it too. Wade Corliss was 61 that year, gray as a winter fence, a man of about 11 words a day, and every one of them load-bearing. He'd made my father a promise on his deathbed. I didn't yet know what the whole of it was, and he watched over me those years like a dog watches a gate. A week after Emmett simplified the accounts, Wade came to me in the tack room with his hat in his hands. He'd been to Slate Creek for horseshoes, and at the counter of the Stock and Loan he'd seen a paper he wasn't meant to see. And Wade, who reads slow but reads sure, had read enough of it to go cold. "He's mortgaged the bottomland," Wade said. "The bottom strip along the creek. Signed it over to the bank against a loan. August Krell holds the paper. The bottomland was the best grass we had. My father called it the reason the herd wintered fat while other men's went thin. Emmett had borrowed money against it and pocketed the cash, and I would have bet my life the cash never came within a mile of the ranch. So I did a thing I hadn't done since the funeral. I rode into Slate Creek myself. The Territorial Stock and Loan was a low stone building on the corner of the main street, cool inside, smelling of ink and pipe smoke and the particular dust that gathers on ledgers. August Krell was the loan officer. A man in his 40s, careful, spectacled. The kind of man who is neither cruel nor kind because his loyalty is entirely to the balance of a column. I've since come to think of Krell as a tool. Not a villain. A good tool in a bad hand becomes a bad thing, and in a better hand becomes something else. Hold that. It matters later. I told him I'd come to understand the accounts since I ran the outfit those accounts described. He looked at me over his spectacles a long moment, taking my measure, and then he did something Emmett never would have. He treated me as a person who could count. He showed me the mortgage on the bottomland. He showed me the loan against it. And then, quiet, half his voice apology and half of it warning, he said a thing I did not react to at the time. A thing I filed away the way you file a strange track you can't place. I'd know it when I saw the animal. "Between us, Miss Ryland," Krell said, "Lo, your uncle's paper isn't worth the ink lately. He's borrowed against everything and paid back nothing. The men who hold his notes have started to whisper he'll go under before spring. A man in that position," he stopped, chose the words, "a man in that position, his debts can be bought. Cheap. Pennies on the dollar. If a person wanted them. Nobody expects to collect, you see, so they'll sell the note just to have something in hand rather than nothing." I said nothing. I thanked him for his plainness, and I rode home. I want to be honest with you about that moment, because the stories always make the woman clever all at once, and it wasn't like that. I did not ride out of Slate Creek with a plan. I rode out with a splinter, a single sentence lodged under the skin. A man's debts can be bought, cheap, and nobody expects to collect. I didn't know yet what I'd do with it. I only knew it wouldn't come out. The seed was planted as nothing. That's the only way the good ones ever are. Now the fall turned hard, and the thing that had been small stopped being small. I learned later what was driving Emmett, though I pieced it together in fragments. He was into Cade Mercer for more than he could ever pay. Mercer owned the Antler House, dealt his own faro, and held the largest private marker on my uncle's neck, a debt with no bank behind it and no patience in front of it. Mercer was 39, sleek, a man who smiled with his mouth, and Mercer had begun to lean. A bank will wait. A bank sends letters. A man like Mercer sends a look across a card table that says "pay me" or "be sorry," and Emmett had run out of ways to answer that look. So he did the thing my father warned me he would do the very first winter I was old enough to understand it. He reached for the cattle. I didn't know it was happening until it had happened. That's the cruelty of it. He didn't tell me. He didn't need to. The court said the herd was his to sell, and so one gray afternoon a drover named Harlan Boone came through Slate Creek headed north, with an empty road ahead of him and cash to spend, and my uncle sold him 120 head of Ryland cattle for $600. $600 for a herd worth $1,800 if it was worth a dime. A third of their value, sold in an afternoon to a stranger passing through, because Emmett didn't need what they were worth. He needed cash in his fist by Friday, and Boone had it, and that was the whole of the arithmetic to a man like my uncle. I found out because a boy rode out to tell Wade the pens at Slate Creek were full of Ryland stock with another man's road brand going on over ours. Wade told me. And I did something I still don't fully understand. I saddled up and I rode into town to watch. Maybe I needed to see it with my own eyes. Maybe some part of me still didn't believe a man could do it in daylight. Maybe I just wanted to be a witness to my own robbing, so that no one could ever tell me later that I'd imagined the size of it. The Slate Creek stockyard sat at the edge of town where the rail spur ran out. When I got there, the dust was already up, a brown haze standing over the pens in the flat afternoon light, and the cattle were bawling the way they do when they've been cut from the only ground they know. My cattle. I knew them by their faces the way you know a person. There was the old brockle-faced cow that always calved first. There was the steer with the split ear I doctored as a yearling. All of them milling, all of them sold, and men on the rails with tally sticks moving them through. 9 drovers there were, working Boone's herd and their own. The auction clerk stood at the little desk with his book. And my uncle stood at the rail with Harlan Boone, and even from across the yard I could see the money change hands. A fold of bills, Boone counting it out into Emmett's palm right there in the open, the way you'd pay a man for a horse you didn't much want. I got down and I walked across that yard, and the men saw me come, and one by one they went quiet. They knew whose cattle those were. Everybody in Slate Creek knew the Ryland girl ran the Ryland outfit. And they knew what it meant that the guardian was standing at the rail with a stranger's cash, and the niece was walking up with dust on her skirt and nothing in her hands. I stopped in front of Emmett. I didn't shout. I've never once in this whole story raised my voice, and I want you to hold that, because it's the hinge the rest of it swings on. I said, "You sold the herd." He put the money in his coat. He was a little drunk, or a little frightened, or both, and men who are both get cruel to cover it. He looked around at the drovers listening, and he decided, I think, to make a small girl smaller so the watching men would see a big man. "I sold some cattle," he said. "My cattle, by the court's word. And I'll thank you not to make a scene in front of working men over a few head of beef." Then he laughed, and he raised his voice so the whole yard had it, and he said the thing I told you at the start. The thing I've carried 9 years. "They're just cows, Della. You cry over cows and wonder why no man'll have you." 9 men heard it. The clerk heard it. Harlan Boone looked at his boots. The dust hung in the light and the cattle bawled, and my uncle stood there pleased with himself for a joke made out of my whole life. And I did not cry. I looked past him at the pens, and I did the only thing that steadied me, the thing my father built into my hands at that kitchen table before I could read. I counted them. Out of habit. I ran my eyes down the rails and I counted the head, 1 to 120, every face I knew, and I made the tally in my mind the way I'd have made it in the book. And when I had them all counted, I looked back at my uncle, and I said nothing at all, and I turned and walked to my horse. He thought he'd won because I was quiet. Understand that. He rode home that night, believing the matter closed, because the girl hadn't screamed, hadn't gone to the sheriff, hadn't done any of the loud, useless things he'd braced for. My silence read to him as defeat. It wasn't defeat. It was arithmetic. He'd just watched me count, and he didn't know what I was counting. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at my father's table with the lamp turned low and the tally book open in front of me, and I did a thing that probably looks like madness from the outside. I wrote the stolen herd into the book. 120 head, in my father's column, in my hand made to match his, as if they were still ours. Because in the only ledger that mattered to me, they were. A cow you can't account for is a cow you've already lost, but I could account for every one of these. I knew where they were. I knew who took them, and for how much. And a debt you can name is a debt that can be called. That was the night Krell's words came back to me and stopped being a splinter and started being a shape. A man's debts can be bought. Cheap. Nobody expects to collect. Emmett owed everybody. He owed the bank against my bottomland. He owed the feed store and the horse trader from years of running short. And he owed Cade Mercer a private marker bigger than all the rest. Every one of those was a paper with my uncle's name signed to it, and every holder of those papers thought the same thing Krell thought, that Emmett Vane was going under before spring, and their note was worth less every week. They wanted out. They'd sell. And a person who bought all that paper, who quietly gathered up every note my uncle owed, that person could do to him the exact thing the bank was waiting to do. Call the debt. All of it. At once. And when he couldn't pay, foreclose, the law that handed my father's estate to Emmett because I was a woman, that same law would enforce a promissory note held by a woman just the same as one held by a man. The law didn't care who I was when there was a signature and a sum. That was the crack in the whole rotten wall. Emmett had spent 3 years using the law as a fence around me. I could reach through the one gap he never thought to close, because he never once imagined the girl read paper better than he did. But I had one problem, and it was the size of everything. To buy a man's debts, even cheap, you need money. And I didn't have $1 to my name. Emmett held the accounts. I ran a ranch I didn't own and drew no wage from it. I was rich in cattle that had just been stolen and poor in every coin. I sat in that lamplight and did the sum, and the sum came up empty. And for the first time since the gate, I felt the bottom go out of it. Then, Wade Corliss came to the door. It was past midnight. He'd seen my lamp burning. He came in with his hat in his hands the way he always did, and he stood there a long moment working up to something, and I could see it cost him. Wade didn't spend words. When he spent this many, it was because he'd been carrying them a long way. "Della," he said, "there's a thing I've held since your father's funeral. He made me swear it, and I swore, and maybe I've held it too long. But after today I can't hold it another hour." He set a leather poke on the table. Heavy, it thumped the wood the way only one thing thumps. $800, Wade said. "Gold. Your father gave it to me the week before he passed. He said it was your start." "Yours, not the estate's." He was particular. He said, "Wade, when the time comes that Della needs it, you put it in her hand and no one else's." He didn't leave it with the bank. He didn't leave it in the accounts. Wade looked at me steady. He left it with me because he didn't trust his wife's brother an inch, and he was afraid the day would come the boy got his hands on everything. Looks like he saw it coming better than we did. $800. My father, dying, saw the whole of this, saw Emmett, saw the court, saw the reaching hand, and he hit a start for me where the guardian would never think to look, in the pocket of a foreman's honesty. Emmett never knew that gold existed. To this day, I don't think he ever knew. I put my hand on the poke, and I felt the weight of it, and I felt my father in it, reaching from the ground to put money in his daughter's hand the way the law never would. And here's the thing I need you to sit with. Even with the gold, the sum still didn't close. I got out my father's pencil, and I made Krell tell me over the next days, careful as I could, what Emmett actually owed. It came to something over $2,000 in all, near $2,100, the face of it, the bank's note against my bottomland, the feed store, the horse trader, and Mercer's marker, the big ugly one, the most of it. $2,100 of debt. And I had 8. If those notes had been worth their face, I'd have had no chance at all. 800 against 2,100 is a losing hand any way you deal it. But they weren't worth their face. That was the whole miracle and the whole cruelty of it. Because every man holding a piece of Emmett vein expected to collect nothing. They'd watched him sink for a year. To them, a note for $300 from a man about to go under wasn't worth $300. It was worth whatever cash a body would put in their hand today to take the worthless thing off them. 100. 80. Whatever they could get before the whole debt turned to smoke. So, the paper traded low. Pennies on the dollar, Krell had said, and Krell didn't exaggerate about numbers. $2,100 of my uncle's debt could be bought if you were quiet, if you were quick, if you got there before he actually went under and the notes turned truly worthless, for something near the 800 my father had hidden in a foreman's coat. I sat there and I ran it 3 times to be sure, my father's pencil in my hand, his book open, his gold on the table, and the 3rd time it came out the same as the first. $800 of my father's foresight, spent right, could buy me every dollar my uncle owed the world. And then I would own him. Not his cattle, not his good coat, him, every debt, every signature, every marker, all of it in my hand, and the law standing behind me for once, instead of in front of me. I could call it all due in a single morning, and when he couldn't pay, the ranch, the standing, the guardianship, the whole life he'd built on top of my father's grave, would come down on his head, lawfully, in front of the same 9 men who heard him call them just cows. I closed the book. I put my hand flat on the soft leather cover the way my father used to. Outside, the wind came up off the draw where the pens stood empty. Somewhere north, Harlan Boone was driving my cattle toward a market that would never know their names. And in Slate Creek, my uncle was sleeping the easy sleep of a man who thinks a quiet woman is a beaten one. I let him sleep. Let him have Friday. Let him have his $600 and his joke and his card table and every last comfortable day he had left, because I understood now that I was going to take them one at a time, on paper, in silence, and he would not feel my hand on his throat until the morning it closed. There was only one place to start. The bank. Krell's note. The one against my father's bottomland, the biggest single piece the bank held. If I was going to become my uncle's creditor, I'd become it at the very desk where he'd made me small, buying back the very ground he'd borrowed against. I saddled up before first light. The poke of gold rode heavy inside my coat, against my heart. $800 of a dead man's love for a living daughter. And I turned my horse toward Slate Creek, toward August Krell's cool stone office, and the question I was about to ask him across his own desk, the question no one in that town figured a woman would ever think to ask. August Krell's office was the coolest room in Slate Creek, even in July. Stone walls, a floor of poured cement, a single window set high so no one could see in. I'd stood at his counter 3 days before and been made to feel like a child asking after her father's money. Now I came in through the same door, but I did not stop at the counter. I asked the clerk if Mr. Krell could see me on a matter of business. Private business. He kept me waiting a quarter hour. That was fine. I'd waited 3 years. I could wait a quarter hour more. When he waved me back, he was writing, and he didn't look up right away. That was his habit. Make the small feel small. I'd seen him do it to my uncle, and I'd seen my uncle do it to me, and I understood now that the whole town ran on it, men shrinking other people down to a size they could pocket. I sat before he offered me the chair. Miss Ryland. He set his pen down. If this is about the bottomland mortgage, I told you Tuesday, there's nothing I can do. Your uncle signed it, and he's within his rights. It's not about the mortgage, I said. It's about the note behind it. He waited. You told me something Tuesday. You may not remember saying it. You said my uncle's paper wasn't worth the ink. You said a man could buy it back for pennies on the dollar, if a man wanted to. Now he looked at me. Really looked, the way you look at a horse that's just done something you didn't think a horse could do. I did say that. Then I'd like to buy it. The note the bank holds against Emmett Vane. All of it. Assigned to my name. For a long moment he said nothing. Outside I could hear a wagon going by, the creak of it, a dog somewhere. Krell folded his hands on the desk. You understand what you're asking. I understand it better than my uncle does. He borrowed against ground my father cleared. The bank expects to lose on it, because it expects him to go under, so the note's worth less than its face. I want to pay you what it's worth to you today, and take it off your books, and hold it myself. And then, it's my paper, not yours. What I do with it is my affair. I watched him do the arithmetic behind his eyes. A bank does not love a note it expects to default. A bank loves cash on the desk more than a claim it may have to chase through a court. I'd learned that at the same kitchen table where I'd learned to tally calves, cattle is just debt you can feed, and a debt is only worth what a body will actually pay you for it. The face is 1,100, he said, with the interest run to date. And what's it worth to you today, Mr. Krell? Not on paper. In your hand. This morning, gone off your ledger clean. He named a figure. It was less than half. I opened my coat and set the poke of gold on his desk, and I counted it out onto the cool wood in front of him, coin by coin, my father's coins, and I did not let my hand shake once. When it was done, there was still weight left in the poke. Not much. But some. Krell drew the assignment papers himself. He wrote my name where the banks had been. He blotted it, and he turned it, and he slid it across the desk to me, and in that small motion the whole shape of my life turned over. 3 days before, at that counter, I'd been a girl who couldn't be told her own family's business. Now I held a claim on the man who'd hidden it from me. Miss Ryland. He capped his pen. May I ask what you intend? You may ask. He almost smiled. Your uncle comes in here twice a month to beg me for time. He'll come in this week, I expect. When he does, I said, you'll tell him nothing has changed. Because from his side, nothing has. I folded the paper into my coat where the gold had been, against my heart, and I walked back out through the cool stone room into the heat, and no one on the street knew that the quiet Ryland girl had just become her uncle's creditor. That was the first note. There were more. I did not do it all at once. A woman buying up a man's debts is a thing that gets talked about, and talk was the one thing I couldn't afford. So I did it the way my father tallied calves, one at a time, in a clean column, on a slow afternoon when nobody was counting. The feed store first. Old Pruitt held a note on Emmett for grain and salt and wire, $60-odd run up over a year, and Pruitt long past expecting to see it. I went in on a Wednesday for flour and thread, ordinary as milk, and while he wrapped my parcel I asked, quiet, whether he'd sooner have a little hard money now than a lot of nothing later. He near fell over himself saying yes. I paid him $40 on the $60. He thanked me. He thought I was a fool, doing my uncle a kindness. Let him. Then the horse trader, Dunmore, out on the Cheyenne Road. Emmett owed him on a saddle horse he'd bought and never paid for, the way he bought everything, grand, and on credit, and forgotten. Dunmore was harder. He wanted to know why. I told him the truth, or a slice of it thin enough to swallow. I said I was setting my family's accounts in order. He liked the sound of a woman doing that. He sold me the note, 2 notes in my coat now, and the banks beneath them. And still, at home, nothing changed. That was the strange part. That was the part I hadn't braced for. Every evening I went back to the ranch, and I kept Emmett's house the way I'd kept it for 3 years. I fried his supper. I poured his coffee. I sat across the table while he grumbled about his luck, about the drovers, about a town that didn't respect a man of standing, and I said yes and no in the right places, and I did not once let my face move. He'd sold my cattle for $600 in front of 9 men, and I served him his eggs the next week, and he never once suspected that the woman salting his plate had bought the bank out from under him. There is a kind of quiet that a cruel man reads as defeat. Emmett read me that way. It made him easy. It made him careless. He'd stopped even bothering to lie to me. He'd talk his troubles out loud across his own supper, because he'd decided I was furniture, and furniture doesn't testify. So I learned things. I learned Mercer was pressing him. I learned the ranch sale he was cooking, he meant to sell the house itself, my father's house, the roof my father raised, to clear the faro dealer at the Antler House and keep his neck. He said it right at the table, chewing, like a man reading weather. Might have to let the old place go. Della, get us rooms in town. You'd like town. As though he were doing me a favor. As though the house weren't the last thing standing that my father had touched. I said, whatever you think best, uncle, and I meant nothing by it that he could hear, and everything by it that he couldn't. The banknote wanted finishing. Krell had assigned it, but the formal transfer needed my signature entered in the book, and I rode in to do it on a Thursday morning. I was at the counter with the clerk, the assignment open between us, my name half written into the ledger, when the door opened behind me and I heard my uncle's voice. Krell, I need to talk to you about that extension. My whole spine went to ice. The paper on the counter had my name on it, and Emmett's name on it, and the word assigned across the top in Krell's flat hand. If he came to the counter, if he so much as glanced down... The clerk was quicker than I gave him credit for. He slid a blotter over the page, easy, like a man tidying, and he said, Mr. Krell's just stepped to the vault, sir. If you'll take a seat, he'll be right with you. And to me, lo, back room, Miss Ryland. The door there. I went. I stepped through into the little back room where they kept the deed boxes. And I stood against the cold shelves, with my heart going like a trapped bird, listening to my uncle drop into a chair not 8 feet away and start in on Krell, who'd appeared from nowhere, buttoning his coat, calm as Sunday, about needing more time. Just a little more time. He had a sale working. He'd be square by fall. "I'm sure something can be arranged," Krell said, in the exact bored voice he used on me. "The bank's in no hurry, Mr. Vane. The bank." There was no bank anymore. The bank was standing in a cold back room with her father's coins gone from her coat and his claim in their place, holding her breath. Krell sold my uncle 5 minutes of comfort he no longer had any right to feel, and Emmett bought it, thanked him even, and left. I heard the door. I came out. Krell didn't look up from his ledger. "He'll be square by fall," he said, dry, so he tells me. "He'll be square sooner than that," I said. There was one note left, the worst one, the one that mattered. Cade Mercer held the biggest single marker Emmett owed, the faro debt, the private paper, the largest of the lot, and the one that gave Mercer the leverage to push my uncle to sell the house. If I bought the bank, the feed store, and the horse trader but left Mercer holding his marker, then when the reckoning came, Emmett could still turn to Mercer, and Mercer could still deal. I needed all of it. Every signature in one hand. Mine, I did not want to go to the Antler House. It was no place for a woman, and everyone in it would remember I'd been there. But there was no other door to Mercer, so I put on my coat and I counted what I had left, and it was thin. Buying 3 notes had eaten most of $800, and Mercer's marker was the fattest of the 4, and Mercer was not a feed store man who'd take 40 on the 60 and thank me. Mercer was 39 years old and hard as a horseshoe, and he did not do favors. But he was greedy. And greed, I'd come to understand, will sell a man his own throat if you count the money slow enough. I went at midday. When the place was near empty, the lamps out, a boy sweeping. Mercer was at his table, doing his own accounts, and he looked up at me the way the whole town looked up at me lately, like a horse that had learned a trick. "You're Vane's girl. His niece. I've come about the marker you hold on him." He set his pencil down. "Have you? He can't pay it," I said. "You know that better than I do. You've been squeezing a stone. He's going to sell the house to clear you, but a house takes months to sell, and you'll wait months, and you might still get shorted if the sale falls through. Or you take cash from me today and you're done with him. Clean this afternoon." I watched it work on him the same way it had worked on Krell, the same way it worked on all of them, because they were all the same animal under the paint. A hard sum you might never collect, or a soft sum sitting in a poke on the table. Mercer looked at me a long time. He was the only one of the 4 who came close to seeing it. I caught something move behind his eyes, some flicker of a question. Why does the quiet girl want her uncle's debts? But greed talked louder than the question. It always does. That was the whole engine of the thing I'd built. "The marker's 500, he said. I had 460. I laid it out on his table, slow, coin and note, and it made a good pile, and I let him look at it. His hand actually moved toward it. Then he counted, because a faro dealer always counts, and he stopped. "That's short. 40 short. It's what I have. Then it's no deal." He sat back. "I'm not a charity girl. 500 or the marker stays in my box and I collect it my own way. And I was $40 from losing the whole thing. 3 notes bought, the trap all but shut, and the last jaw of it stuck open for the want of $40. I felt the floor of it go soft under me. "Then I'll come back," I started to say, and behind me the door opened, and boots crossed the floor, and Wade Corliss's voice came over my shoulder, rough and quiet. "The lady's not short." He came up beside me, 61 years old, hat in one hand, and in the other a little roll of bills soft from being carried, and I knew what it was before he set it down. It was his wages. It was 3 years of a foreman's pay that a man saves against being too old to fork hay. He laid 2 20s on the pile without once looking at me, because he knew if he looked at me, I'd tell him no. And he'd made a promise to a dying man that he wasn't done keeping. "Count it again," Wade said. Mercer counted it again. 500. He took it. He dug the marker out of his box and signed it over, Emmett Vane's own scrawl staring up at me, and he pushed it across the felt, and he had no notion on God's earth that he'd just handed a girl the last cartridge for a gun already loaded at his friend's head. Outside, in the light, I couldn't speak for a second. Wade put his hat back on. "Your father'd have done the same for mine," was all he said. "Don't make a thing of it." I didn't make a thing of it. But I never forgot it, and neither should you. 4 notes. The bank, the feed store, the horse trader, the faro marker. Near $2,100 of face debt, every dollar my uncle owed in the world, bought for $840 out of a dead man's love and an old man's wages, and all of it, in one coat, over one heart. Now I only had to wait for him to walk into a room where I was already sitting. I didn't have to wait long. Emmett did the last of my work for me himself. That week at the Antler House, feeling flush on a promise, feeling like a man about to be saved, my uncle told Cade Mercer across the bar that he'd pay him in full come Friday. Every cent. The house sale was as good as done, he said, and Mercer would be first paid. And Mercer, who 3 days before had signed his marker over to me, Mercer laughed out loud in front of the room. "Pay me?" he said. "Emmett, you don't owe me a nickel. Pay the girl." He was still grinning. "She bought you out. Every marker. She owns you now." Emmett thought it was a joke. He came home that night and he was gray under the lamp, and he asked me, at his own table, over the supper I'd cooked him, whether I'd heard some fool rumor going around town about me and his debts. He half laughed asking it. He wanted me to laugh too. He wanted me to say Mercer was drunk. I looked at him across the table, and for the first time in 3 years, I let him see my whole face. "Settlement day's Friday," I said, "at the bank. You'll want to be there, Uncle," and I got up and cleared his plate. Friday came bright and dry. Cattleman's settlement day at the Territorial Stock Loan, when the season's paper came due and the front room filled with men squaring accounts. I got there early. I took a chair against the wall, and I set my father's tally book on the desk in front of me, closed, my hand flat on the soft leather cover the way he used to lay his. And I waited, and the room filled. Krell at his desk. Mercer come to watch, curious, arms folded. Harlan Boone, in town to sell the last of a string, standing near the door with his hat pushed back. Wade against the far wall, still, saying nothing. And the auction clerk, the same young clerk who'd cried the $600 sale of my cattle at the stockyard rail, who'd watched my uncle pocket the money and call me a thing no man would have. He was there too, to keep the day's record. The same witnesses as the wound. That was the part I'd wanted most, and hadn't dared hope for, and got. Emmett came in last, near noon, with a land agent at his elbow and papers under his arm for the sale of the house, his salvation, he thought, his clean way out. He saw me against the wall, and he checked, just a half step, and then he decided I was furniture again and looked past me to Krell. "August, let's get the house business done. I've got a buyer and I mean to clear my accounts today, every one, and be shut of this. Before you do, Mr. Vane." Krell folded his hands. He did not raise his voice. He never did. "There's a matter of your outstanding notes. It's my duty to inform the room that every note of debt standing against your name, the bank's mortgage on the bottomland, the feed store account, the Dunmore horse note, and the private marker formerly held by Mr. Mercer has been purchased and assigned entire to a single holder, and that holder has this morning called them all due. In full. At once." The room went quiet, the way a canyon goes quiet. Emmett laughed. It came out of him wrong, too loud. Called due by who? Who in this town's got the "who holds my paper"? Krell looked at me. Everyone looked at me. I stood up. I picked up my father's tally book, and I walked to the desk, and I laid the 4 notes down on the wood one at a time. So the sound of each was its own small thing in that silent room. The banknote, the feed store, the horse trader. And on top, last, Cade Mercer's marker with Emmett's own signature staring up. I turned them so they faced him, so he could read his own hand 4 times over. He stared at them. He didn't understand yet. His mouth worked. "You told me they were just cows, Uncle," I said. My voice came out flat and dry and even, the way I'd practiced it against 3 years of swallowed words. "You said I cried over cattle and wondered why no man would have me. You said it in front of 9 men at the rail." I put one finger on the marker. "Turns out you were just paper. And I bought all of it. I have thought a long time about how to tell you what happened to my uncle's face in that room, and the truest thing I can say is that I watched a man understand, in front of the whole town that had feared him, that the quiet girl at his supper table had been reading his throat like a ledger for a month, and that the hand he'd never once felt had just closed." He turned to the land agent. The land agent was already folding his papers away. A house sale takes weeks. The debt was called due today. There was nothing to sell fast enough. The bottom land was mortgaged to me, the house was security to me, and I was the one creditor in the territory who would not, under any argument he could make, grant him a single day's grace. He turned to Krell. But Krell only shook his head, because the bank held nothing now. He turned to Mercer, and Mercer was staring at his own hands. The court moved fast, once it moved. A guardian who has run an estate into total default, who has sold his ward's herd for 1/3 of its worth and mortgaged her inheritance to feed a pharaoh table, is not a guardian the law protects for long. Within the month, the same court that had handed Emmett everything 3 years before, on no better ground than that he was a man and I was not, looked at the ledgers and took it all back. The guardianship dissolved. The estate, the house, the land, the standing, every stick of it that could be salvaged from his debts, which, the debts being in my hand, meant was all of it, restored to Della Ryland, of age, of sound account. At last. That was Emmett. Now the others, because a thing like this doesn't fall on one man alone. Cade Mercer sat in that front room and did the arithmetic he should have done in his saloon a week before. He'd held the largest marker Emmett owed. It was the one piece of leverage in town that could have squeezed something out of the house sale. Mercer could have waited, could have pressed, could have taken his cut off the top. Instead, he'd sold it to me for cash in hand, because greed can't see past the money on the table, and now the man who owed him was falling, and Mercer had no hook left to sink, because he'd handed me the hook himself. He'd armed the girl and called it profit. He got his $500. He lost the only thing that would have let him collect 500 more. He didn't say a word. He got up and left, and I never had trouble from him, because there was no longer anything about me he could reach. Harlan Boone was the loose thread, and I'd pulled on it quietly all week. The sale of my 120 head had been done in a rush, at 1/3 of value, by a guardian already deep in default, and a rushed, underpriced sale of estate property by a man about to lose his standing is a sale a court will look at hard. There was a lien question. There was the matter of whether Emmett had the clean right to sell at all, with the estate already sliding. Boone was no villain. He'd bought fair as far as he knew, but he was a practical man, and when I offered to make his part clean and simple, to take the herd back off his hands at exactly what he'd paid for them, he took it. $600. The same $600 my uncle had pocketed at the rail and thrown in my face. I paid it back to Boone dry, out of the estate the court restored to me, and the number closed on itself like a gate swinging shut. 120 head of Ryland cattle turned north again and came home. And August Krell, who was never a villain, only the instrument, Krell closed his ledger. He drew a line under the account of Emmett Vane, and he capped his pen, and he looked at me across the same desk where he'd made me feel small, and he said, "Miss Ryland, the account is settled." That was all. From him, it was a great deal. I never raised my voice. I want you to notice that, because it's the part that matters. Not once, in the whole of it, from the empty pen at first light to the 4 notes on the desk, did I shout, or weep where he could see it, or beg a single man for a single thing. My father warned me from the grave, the $800 in gold, left with Wade and not with Emmett, because Amos Ryland knew his wife's brother down to the bone and made sure the money to fight him was in an honest man's hands. Wade kept faith for 3 years and never spent a coin of it on himself, and covered the last 40 out of his own pocket besides. I had a dead man's foresight and a living man's loyalty behind me. All I did was read the paper the way my father taught me at the kitchen table, and wait, and let a cruel man mistake my patience for defeat until the morning it cost him everything. 6 months on, it was dawn at Ryland's draw. I'll tell you what that looks like, because it's the picture I hold when the town still whispers. The North Pen full again, 120 head and more coming, their breath standing up in the cold like smoke off a fire. Steam curling off the coffee cup I set on the porch rail. The sun coming up honey-colored over the bottomland my father cleared, and I bought back. And on the kitchen table inside, the leather tally book open to a fresh clean column, in my own hand now. Every calf tallied the way he taught me. Cattle is just debt you can feed, and I'd learned there was a second half to that lesson he never got to say out loud, which is that a debt is a rope, and it matters a great deal which end of it you're holding. Emmett came to the gate that morning. He'd had 6 months of town, of rooms he couldn't pay for, and a standing that was gone, and men who used to fear him looking through him on the street. He'd been let go by everything. He came up the road on foot, thin, his good coat worn shiny, and he stopped at the gate my father hung, and he didn't come through it. He asked me for a room. He asked me for work. I stood on the porch with my coffee, and I looked at him a while. The man who'd sold my cattle for $600 and told 9 men no one would ever have me. The man whose plate I'd salted a month while I bought his throat out from under him. "There's a bunk in the hands' quarters," I said. "Wade runs the crew. You'll take his orders like any man. You can earn cattle now, Uncle. Honest, $40 a month and found, or you can turn around and walk back to town. I don't cry over either one." He looked at me. Whatever he'd been going to say, he didn't say it. He came through the gate. He stayed. That's the part folks always want the end of, so I'll give it to you plain. The man who sold my herd out from under me mucks the stalls of it now, every morning, before the sun's full up. He forks the hay, and he mends the wire, and he calls me Miss Ryland, because that's what the crew calls me, and he's crew. I don't gloat over it. There's no pleasure in it worth having. But there's a rightness in it, a thing squared, that I feel every time I pass the pen and see him at the far end of it, working, under the roof my father built and I bought back, earning the cattle he once sold for the price of a night at a card table. My father used to say cattle is just debt you can feed. I fed mine. And in the end it fed me back. That's the whole of it. How a quiet woman in a territory that didn't count her as a person took a cruel man's cruelty and turned it into paper, and turned the paper into a rope, and never once had to raise her voice. If you've ever been treated as furniture by your own blood, I hope Della's mourning at that gate stays with you. And I'd like to know how far this story's ridden, so tell me, down in the comments, the town you're watching from. I want to see just how far Della's still riding.